So last week we discussed the image of the child, the construction of childhoods, and how this construction informs pedagogy. How our image of the child informs how we understand the construction of knowledge, and also how our image of the child is intimately linked to how we see education and what education is for. If education is a project in future making, then the subjects we aim to create in educational processes are in the service of the kinds of futures that we desire. Yet these desires are not at all neutral. They're informed by the socio-political conditions of our time and place, and largely by the normative discourses that we assume and therefore predicate what is desirable, what kind of life is deemed a good one, and with that, what constitutes a good education in the pursuit of this life. So this week we'll be deepening our questioning of who the child is in a neoliberal state. So originating some of the conversations that have been emerging in the forums, specifically with regard to how our construction of childhood is in deep relation with the socio-political and economic needs and desires of the state, and how this then informs common pedagogical orientations in early childhood education and the making of the early childhood institution as a place where those subjectivities are created, as we've read in this chapter this week. Thinking back to our week with Foucault, it's important not to assume that neoliberalism is something that exists only out there. Something that's only impeding on us or influencing us, but rather something that operates through discursive logics, through surveillance of ourselves in relation with each other, and how we are subjects of and subjects to neoliberalism. That we actually negotiate these dynamics as they live not only around, but through us, through the structures that we live and through our minds as we work in relation with those structures. So what is neoliberalism? I'm going to draw on Springer, Birch, and McLeavy when they write that at a base level, we can say that when we make reference to neoliberalism, we're generally referring to the new political, economic, and social arrangements within society that emphasize market relations, retasking the role of the state or the government to individual responsibility. And most scholars tend to agree that neoliberalism is broadly defined as the extension of competitive markets into all areas of life, including the economy, politics, and society. So some of the words that come to mind when we think of neoliberalism, or when I think of neoliberalism, are progress, development, wealth, freedom, autonomy, individualism, competition. Freedom is an important word here because it really exemplifies the logic of this market ideology, not one which only operates within economic principles, but also in our ways of thinking and living. Neoliberalism undermines the governing mechanics of democracy that enable a public question, a public voice, and under the guise of privatized individual agency, in this week's video by Chomsky, he discusses how neoliberal systems pacify collective or public thought and place responsibility of social order in the individual consumer and their relation within capitalist markets. So by placing individual responsibility upon people, there's an illusion of a freedom of choice that's actually regulated within capitalist markets. So in this week's reading, Christina Vintimilla argues that focusing on neoliberalism's political and social consequences requires us to think about neoliberalism beyond economic definitions and examine it as, quote, a rationality, one which expands its normative ideology and values to other spheres of our lives through discourses and practices, end quote. So as early childhood educators, we can think about how neoliberalism provokes us, how its logics informs the norms in which we situate ourselves in educational processes. So how does neoliberalism show up in our work? That's going to be something that we're discussing this week. So individualism, competition, and all too familiar discourses of free play and free choice, stations where children can freely move in early childhood spaces, yet this illusion of freedom is actually reliant on very specific, yet often unnoticed, social surveillances and governance that regulate children's bodies in ways that ensure they're able to grow and develop into autonomous, accumulating, freely acting, and choosing consumers. So one metaphor that might be helpful in coming to understand the logics of neoliberalism is when an adult offers a child a choice of eating their carrots or their broccoli as a way to get them to eat their vegetables. There really is an illusion or a freedom of choice in that the child gets to choose, but either way, the child is eating their vegetables. There really is no choice in neoliberal society because we're all discursively regulated to believe that there's free choice, but our choices are actually predicated on our social positions and access to those choices. So under neoliberalism, things and people gain value as long as there's some kind of gain or profit attached. So schools can become well-oiled machines that produce narrow visions of who one can be and become within these mechanisms. So the Early Childhood Center is a place of hyper-neoliberalism. And in BC, it's become, as Dahlberg, Voss, and Pence write, a service, which within its structures of supplier-client relations produces particular conditions where parents and families become clients and children the product, and early childhood institutions the sales people. This creates educational experiences that are focused on pleasing the consumer and supporting the service provided, and discourses of quality are very much caught up in this idea. So the educator becomes a deliverer of knowledge in the pursuit of sale, growth, and profit. Here, there's little desire for the educator to become an intellectual, to become a thinking subject, but rather the focus is more on functionality and efficiency of delivering particular curricular outcomes. Knowledge in this way becomes a commodity. And we can see this in many spheres of life, especially here in the neo-colonial university, where knowledge is a product, where knowledge becomes palatable, digestible, and easily swallowed and utilized in the pursuit of individual success and linear accumulation in terms of job markets and the kinds of careers that you might have once you graduate. So developmental psychology is one facet of the neoliberal narrative, which is particularly dominant in education, especially early childhood education. So ages and stages, learning outcomes, evaluation, quality, these are all notions that are very deeply informed by this desire to progress, produce, and accumulate. These are the goals of a neoliberal society, to continue producing. Yet the ways in which individuals are able to move through the world and accumulate wealth within these logics is dependent, as I said before, about dependent upon their social positioning within these systems. So within this flow, certain bodies and ways of knowing are privileged and enable people who have access to these to move through these systems with little blockages. So this week's provocation, you'll be situating your thinking again within the readings, and you'll be writing a 150 to 200 word response to the following questions. Who is the child in the neoliberal early childhood institution? Who is the educator in the neoliberal early childhood institution? What socio-political and economic logics inform these roles? So really think about what is neoliberalism, drawn the video and the article by Christina Vintimilla, and thinking about what are the logics of neoliberalism and how do those logics manifest themselves in the image of the child within this kind of institution and the image of the educator within the same rationality. And also, what do these rationalities do to knowledge-making processes? What is knowledge in a neoliberal institution? So if education is a service that operates within service client systems, who does the child become in this sense, and who does the educator become? So I think that's about it for this week. Please do let me know if you have any questions or if you want to reach out. Thanks, everyone.